Steve Martin from the Governor's Human Recovery Office and I have been helping to put together some webinars for the task force. And those of you who are on the task force will remember that there were several questions that were brought forward around different topics that you wanted some answers to. So these webinars, along with some written content that we are providing to you, are our effort to do just that. And so thanks everyone for being available today. We are going to have quite a few people on the webinar, so just to be clear, as Abby stated before, anyone who is not a panelist or a facilitator will be muted, and we'll go over the process for questions at the end.
Wow. Okay. This is
Here we go.
This is unlike anything I've run before. So thank you for your patience. Again, I am manually muting people, but if you could please make sure to be on mute so that everyone can hear the panelists, that would be fantastic.
Very, very helpful.
Very helpful. So how we're going to do this is, first of all, I'd like to thank our panelists. They did a tremendous amount of pre-work to be here with us today. I hope everyone received either the box links or the attachments that had a series of questions about spill to help people have sort of an equal background walking into this call. So please, if you have not read those, they're a great resource. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go over 4 different questions that various panel members will answer. Some have PowerPoint slides and some will just speak to the questions. They're going to be brief, and you will note that, I'm sorry, my name is Abby Hook. I'm helping facilitate the pre-availability work group for the task force. We will be holding people to time, and we are asking that for the purpose of this call, the only people that really are going to be able to speak are the facilitators and the panelists. So following the set questions, we will have, we hope, about half an hour. Please mute if you're not muted already. Thank you. We've got about half an hour per question. And what we will do is we will start with task force members. And the way that you're going to submit questions is through the chat box. So please, at the bottom of your screen, if you're on WebEx, you should see a series of buttons. The chat box is the one with the speech bubble, and if you click on that, a chat box will pop up, and I'll direct everyone at the end of the call to do this again, but please put your name and the question that you have, and I'll call for task member questions first. And if we have time, we'll move to work group members, and then if we have time, we will move to the public. But I'd really like to know your name and the question, and then I will read it in the order that it comes in. So with that, thank you for your patience. Again, this is kind of unwieldy to do as a webinar, but we're looking forward to hearing the great information that our experts have brought to the table today. So Penny, do you want to go through the panelists while I continue to sort of control for sound?
Yep, that sounds good. Yeah, thanks again for...
look at it!
Okay, we need everyone to mute, please, until I can get to you.
Thanks, everyone, for being available to do this webinar for the task force. We really appreciate it. We've got several folks lined up to answer some of the questions, as Abby stated. Guy Norman is a member of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Michael Garrity is our Columbia River and Water Policy Manager at WDFW. Jim Litchfield is the president of Litchfield Consulting Group. Steve Haysacker and Michelle Hart are going to be presenting together about the comparative survival study, and Michelle is from the Fish Passage Center. Ed Bowles is from ODF&W, where he's the Fish Division Administrator, and Richie Graves is from NOAA, where he's the Chief of Columbia Hydropower Branch. Thanks so much for being with us, and I think we're going to start off with our first basic question to make sure that we're all on the same page about spill. Go ahead, Abby.
Okay, so the question is basically, what is spill? And Michael was going to provide some brief overview for everybody on the phone.
All right. So I'm just going to provide some brief background, what spill is, how it works, and I've got a couple of slides that may help build some of the answers that were provided in question number 1 on the questionnaires that everybody hopefully has taken a look at. As water moves down a river, spill can go through turbines or over spillways. Spill is when the water is routed over the spillways. Spill can be forced to occur at high flows, while at lower flow levels, any spill is voluntary or purposefully routed over the spillways. As at lower flows, dam turbines could have sufficient capacity to handle all the flow, so you don't need spill, you need to want to do it. Depending on how you look at it, juvenile salmon can take two or four routes downstream through or over a dam. The simplest way to look at it is that they can pass a dam via spill or via the powerhouse. If you look at this slide, spill is the area. Oh, I think I have a mouse here. Let's see. Yeah, if I can make it work. Spill is this area, frothy water underneath the spillways. The powerhouse is the area on the right of the slide. There's a finer way of looking at it where you could look at it as conventional spill at most of the spillways. There's a spillway weir that provides for surface spill over in the where my pointer is. And then there's the turbines and the bypass, both of which compose the powerhouse. Turbines, they just go through the energy generating turbines. Bypass, they go through a series of flumes, and then juvenile salmon are either passed back into the river or onto juvenile fish transportation barges. Spill is generally considered to be the safest passage route for salmon and steelhead over the dams. It not only provides high direct survival, but also helps avoid deleterious delayed mortality effects that are correlated with going through the powerhouse, which again is the turbines or the bypass. Let's go to the next slide. For analytical purposes, the comparative survival study, which is a leading analysis of juvenile salmon survival past the dams, puts spill and spillway weirs into the spill bucket and turbines on the bypass into the powerhouse bucket, as I talked about a little bit. Until the 1990s and the first Endangered Species Act listings of salmon and steelhead, most efforts were focused on trying to reduce juvenile salmon mortality by installing technical fixes at the dams like bypass systems and by barging fish around the dams or trucking them around the dams. It became clear that these measures were going to be insufficient to meet ESA protection requirements, and the amount of water spilled over the dams and when spill is in effect has gradually increased since the early 1990s, both through policy choices and through court rulings. This has helped stabilize and in some cases improve salmon runs and salmon returns to the Columbia and Snake and their tributaries, but obviously we're still in a condition of scarcity. Since 2005, courts have been requiring more spring and summer spill than required by NOAA fisheries biops, and in 2018, the Federal District Court for Oregon required dam managers to spill to the total dissolved gas spill caps. Spill caps, or total dissolved gas caps, are in place to limit harm from total dissolved gas, which at high enough levels, and it occurs from the water pouring over the spillways, can cause fish to experience gas bubble disease, which is similar to the bends in divers. To avoid gas bubble disease, Oregon has a tail race only standard right now of 120% total dissolved gas, while Washington has a more conservative 115% forebay standard and 120% tail race standard. Studies looking at what happens when there have been involuntary spill at high levels, often sometimes in high water years well above 125% total dissolved gas, have concluded that gas bubble disease doesn't become acute until probably somewhere above 125% total dissolved gas. Meanwhile, studies like the comparative survival study forecast significant life cycle survival benefits at these higher levels of spill than are currently allowed by either state's gas cap. Hence, there's an ongoing discussion about potentially raising gas caps to accommodate more spill to improve salmon returns, including the measures that are under consideration by the task force. And those, so I guess the action, okay, so let's see. Hydro Action A1 recommends that ecology adjust PDG standards to match or exceed gas caps on the Snake and Columbia to allow flexibility and adjust spill regimes as needed to benefit Chinook salmon and other salmonids. There were a couple of options that were considered by the Prey Working Group. Under this, one would be a smaller adjustment, basically for Washington to match Oregon's existing standard. And another option, and that's the one that was apparently selected by by the work group and is under consideration by the task force, is to go high for both states. Really, to go higher would be the idea, but for Washington's Department of Ecology to adjust gas standards to 125% to allow flexibility to spill up to that level. And I think, as other speakers or all the panelists will probably get into a little bit later, there are different ways that might be more or less flexible that you could go higher. And then Hydro Action A2 is would recommend that ecology adjust TDG standards to I guess the point of these is that it would just direct gas standards to go higher and without the language about to accommodate for flexibility. And it looks like most of the conversation is pointing toward the language that includes flexibility.
Thank you, Michael.
Great. So we know this isn't in presentation mode, and that's okay. We're kind of struggling with how, there we go. That looks better. Thank you, Penny. So now we're going to move into responses across the panelists. And we're going to start with what was question 13, which will tell you that there were 11 other questions that these folks are kind enough to provide background on in the box account. So question number 13 is, what is the smolt to adult survival rate of Chinook with current proposed and traditional levels of spill, and does it vary by Chinook stock? So for this, we're going to start with some slides that Steve, I believe, is going to present from the Fish Pasture Center. Steve, are you on mute?
No, I'm here. Thank you. Just to give you a little bit of background for folks that aren't familiar, the comparative survival study has been in place since 1996, so ongoing 22-year study. It's a collaborative effort between Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's coordinated through the Fish Passage Center. What we basically do in the CSS is summarize and analyze pit tag data, monitoring data on stocks throughout the Columbia River Basin. The CSS project has received annual scientific review by regional agencies, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, and the Independent Scientific Advisory Board, and the Independent Scientific Review Panel. The data analysis and results are presented in annual reports, and the model and data that I'm being presented today have been previously presented at the CSS annual review meetings, as well as presentations to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, as well as scientific meetings. So if we can go to the next slide. What I'm going to be talking about today is information on smolt to adult return rates for 3 wild spring Chinook salmon stocks, the Yakima River spring Chinook, Snake River spring Chinook, as well as the John Day River spring Chinook. In terms of the hydro system experience, the John Day River stock experiences 3 dams during their juvenile outmigration. The Yakima River experiences 4 dams. and the Snake River stock experiences 8 downs. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of summarizing the information that the CSS has collected on smolt-to-adult survival rates, here are the smolt-to-adult survival rates, or SARs, for John Day River, represented by the J's, the Yakima Rivers, represented by the Y, and Snake River Spring Chinook, represented by the S. There's quite a bit of variability among years and between stocks. In terms of the mean SARs, the John Day River has the highest mean SAR of around 4.4%, followed by the Yakima River at 3.7%, and followed much less by the Snake River stocks with a mean SAR of 1.4%. Next slide. Within the CSS, one of the basic questions is trying to understand what factors may be associated with these patterns in survival. And so we've done basically a multiple regression approach where we've looked at a series of freshwater factors, including whether there's any differences in intrinsic survival between stocks, water transit time, which is measuring how long it takes water to pass through the hydro system, as well as the number of powerhouse passages the juveniles experience during exploration. In terms of marine factors, we look at winter ichthyoplankton as well as spring upwelling. Once we fit these models, we applied these models to various spill management scenarios, which include the current biological opinion spill levels, as well as increased spill levels, 115 forebay, 120 tail race, 120 tail race, and 125 tail race, TDG levels. Next slide. Next slide. So in terms of the model results, we found that basically the two marine factors, the ichthyoplankton and upwelling, were both important in showing up in the best fitting models, as well as water transit time and the number of powerhouse passages. So with increased powerhouse passages, the SARs were showing reduction. Next slide. So in terms of applying this model to these different spill management options, here's a summary of the observed SARs. As I mentioned, for the Snake River stocks, the mean was 1.4% and kind of a 80% confidence interval ranging from 0.2% all the way up to 3.1%. Next slide. In terms of the alternative future forecasts of what we would expect SARs to be under the BIOP, it's not much different than what has happened in the 2000 to 2012 period. So our forecasts are suggesting similar SARs. Next slide. However, under the enhanced spill levels, we're expecting increased SARs, with the highest SARs associated with the 125 spill level, which is an average of 3.2% and ranging from around 1% to over 6%. Next slide. Associated with these spill levels, we would also expect these additional stocks lower down the John Day River to experience higher SARs than have occurred historically, and the highest SARs associated with the 125 spill level. Next slide. And finally, for the similar story. We're expecting increased SARs associated with increased spill levels, with the highest SARs associated with the 125 spill level. Next slide. And so the bottom line is that increased spill is expected to improve SARs, and those improvements in SARs relative to the SARs that we would expect in BIOP vary by stock as well as the spill level. In terms of snake, which has lowest current SARs, we would expect almost a doubling associated of SARs associated with the 125 spill level, and increases in SARs for the remaining Yakima and John Day River stock, again with the highest increase associated, the highest increase in spill. And that's about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, for that. So the question, again, is now Ed is up. What is the multi-adult survival rate of Chinook with the current proposed and traditional levels of spill, and does it vary by stock? So, Ed.
Thank you for the opportunity. And could you remind folks, please, to mute their phones? We've gotten a lot of background noise.
Yeah, I'm doing my best on this end, but it's difficult to tell who it is. So please mute if you're not speaking.
All right, go ahead, next slide. Yes, and on this, I wanted to briefly remind folks, I think Michael did a great job on describing what spill is. I wanted to remind folks that these are really, we're talking about main stem dams between the nursery grounds shown here on this slide. A big chunk of that nursery grounds is in relatively pristine wilderness areas. And this is really the connecting them to the ocean feeding grounds where they grow up to be adults. And so these main stem dams are what's at issue relative to spill. And also reiterate the point that this is somewhat independent of flow. Some people confuse that increasing spill relative to water going through the turbines is not really dependent on flow for managed spill. It's just how much water you allocate to which direction. Go ahead. Now, one of the other misconceptions relative to the dams is that it's primarily just an issue of dam passage, and that's what spill addresses, is just how to get fish past each piece of concrete. Really, the biggest ecological change in the fish's life cycle that has occurred since the development of the dams is not only those barriers and passage of those dams, but really a change to the water travel time. If you look on the lower left, historically, these fish evolved and prospered under about a 2-day journey as youngsters following the flow down with the spring snowmelt. That, because of the slack water effects of the dams and the reduction of the slope of the river, because of that, you've now gone to approximately 20 days for that journey. And so the spill is not only used to get past safely as best possible the dams, but also to avoid forebay delays, as Michael mentioned, that could contribute to this delay outside of the evolutionary legacy of these fish. Next. Now, another misconception is that we're just starting to explore spill and we don't know a lot about its benefits or risks. We actually have a long history of spill, some of it managed, but much of it on the backs of the bounty of snowpack and that melt in the spring. And so this graph just shows the relationship over time associated with spill levels that we've seen versus the survival of these fish, the kind of what we call the recruits per spawner. And that dashed line represents replacement. So anything above that line, stocks are able to rebuild and grow. Anything below that line, survival, they're in a deteriorating mode. And the association of these increases in the stocks of fish for spring summer Chinook is almost always associated with increases in spill. Next. Also, we have throughout this long time series knowledge, because we've been listening to the fish and evaluating them and have been able to see whether or not gas bubble trauma, as Michael said, which is similar to the bends, is a problem. And so there's these criteria. And if you look at this, I'm not going to spend much time on it, but the blue bars represent the dashed blue line at the top relative to the criteria. So you can see from the blue, which is the 15%, we are never close to the criteria that would cause concerns. And the x-axis is those amounts of total dissolved gas. So you'll see that till you get into the 125 range, you're really not seeing much of a signature on concern with the fish. And neither of these, the red is associated with the red dashed line, and neither of these criteria are a problem. And as Michael said, 125 does not seem to pose a risk. Next. The smolt to adult survival rates, what I've got here is what has come out of the comparative survival studies that you heard from Steve. Similar information, I did throw in we'll be having another webinar on breach. That's a breach plus 125, showing the best response for increases in fish, but I want to also make it clear that this is not, in my mind, reflecting a near-term solution, so important to the orcas, and it's something that we are supportive of playing out through the environmental impact statement process of the evaluation, which is on its own track. The spill measures are all relatively near-term actions that can be provided, and as Steve had mentioned, the 125% being the most robust and highly likely to contribute to better survival. Next. Two quick ways of looking at this information relative to the spill is in the probability of being in a bad place. So anything below a 1% smolt to adult survival rate is bad. And so the odds of being in a bad place shown here is that you're over 60% going to fall into less than 1%, which is in a deteriorating mode for these stocks of fish. They're actually in decline. Once again, 125 the lowest. And then next slide. And then being in the desirable place, which is above 2%, you can see that in this case, 125 has over a 75% probability of being in a good place, and the biop only a 14%. And just another ways of looking at that same information. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Up next is Richie. And hold on, I need to unmute you. I think I have it.
That would help.
Oh, no, you're there. Great.
Thank you. Good to be here with everybody today. As you said, my name is Richie Graves. I'm representing National Marine Fisheries Service today. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. I appreciate, what other people have been saying about SARS. I just wanted to talk a little bit and give some background on what smolt to adult return estimates, actually are, and some of the things that kind of affect those. And then give just a few examples. So I think the first point that has already been made is that smolt to adult returns, or SARs, encompass multiple life history stages. They're avoiding adults that have already passed upstream and are spawning. They're not catching that part of the life history, and they're not catching the part of the life history where eggs are rearing into juveniles before they start migrating downstream as smolt. So it's an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story, I guess the point. We tend to focus a lot on recruit per spawners within nymphs, which is how many spawners are generated based on how many adults spawn that generation of fish. The other thing is it varies a lot by species. I think we've seen some examples of that. You see differences in SARs between hatchery and wild origin fish, and you see differences in SARs between the type of Chinook in particular they're looking at, whether they're ocean type, which are those species that migrate as sub-yearlings to the ocean, typically have higher mortality rates, versus stream type fish, which spend more time in freshwater before they migrate to the ocean and tend to be larger and have higher survival rates from that point on. Also, SARs vary annually and seasonally. I'll give a couple examples of that. They're location dependent, so you can calculate SARs from just about any place where you have a pit tag detector out to the ocean and back to just about any other place where you have a pit tag detector. I've given some examples on the slides there, but I'm not going to go through that. The main point is you're calculating different numbers when you are calculating SARs at different locations. Also, SARs can be directly observed or inferred. Direct observations are when you actually have detections of fish at either juvenile bypass systems that Michael mentioned, or at the other places at the Bonneville Second Powerhouse Corner Collector, which is a surface passage route there at the project with a pit tag detector in it. So in those instances, you know exactly that you detected that fish. And then when those fish return from the ocean, you know that you detected them as an adult, and you can make that calculation pretty directly. There are other statistical models that you can use to infer the number of fish that must have passed the location based on how those fish mix downstream. And those aren't direct estimates, but it's just another method of doing that sort of thing. And then lastly, they are affected by other factors. The condition of the smolts when they're migrating can affect what the SARs are of those fish. Some good examples of that with some of the sockeye salmon coming out of some of the hatchery production in Idaho have had pretty abysmal juvenile survival rates and out migration and SARs. And those have been traced back to some of the hatchery practices, and those are being remedied. Also, ocean conditions, as Steve alluded to, are important factors for assessing SARs. Next slide. So this is just an example of the entire life cycle of the fish. And SAR, again, the point is once those fish start migrating downstream past some detection point that serves as your start line, then you can estimate how many of those fish actually went out to the ocean, matured, and came back to migrate upstream to where your second start line is. And that would be how you'd estimate your SAR. Next. This is just showing some estimates from the Columbia River DART University of Washington website, where they've made estimates of SARs for Snake River spring summer Chinook. And they're right in line with what Mr. Steve Haseker said. They're between about 0.3 and 3% at this point. So there's a factor of 10 basically in the estimates of those SARs. Next slide. The same thing for an example of a sub-yearling life history. These are Snake River fall Chinook. They tend to have about the same or a little bit lower SARs. Again, you're looking at an order of magnitude between the lows and the highs. And this stock is doing pretty well, even with those SARs. But that's primarily because this stock is not vulnerable to over-summering and overwintering mortalities in tributary habitat because they're hatching from the gravel and migrating quickly to the ocean in the same year that they come out of the gravel. So most of these fish it's just an example of how the life history affects what the SARs are and kind of the whole picture of how you should be viewing this. Next slide. Next slide. There you go. This is just an example of some work from our Science Center where they were looking at fish that were transported at Lower Granite Dam versus fish, that's the green lines in the top panels, versus fish that were bypassed the Lower Granite Dams. Those are fish that were diverted away from the turbine units, went through the bypasses, and were detected there. And these are the estimates of their survival out to the ocean and back all the way to Lower Granite Dam. The left-hand panel are fish that were tagged upstream of Lower Granite, and you can see that there's a difference in the shape of those curves over time during the spring period. In this particular instance, transported fish had higher SARs. That's not always the case, I want to be clear, but it is a good example of how people tend to think of SARs as just a single number encompassing an entire season. But there's actually, curvilinear relationships or flatter relationships as depicted on the right-hand panel of, how those SAR relationships are actually working on fish moving through this. Next slide. And then I would be remiss as a NOAA employee if I didn't note that, we think the ocean is an important factor in estimating SARs. We look at a whole bunch of factors to be able to predict what the overall returns of Chinook are going to be. Next slide. And they model those factors, and when the Science Center makes their estimates in the right-hand panel, they estimate that something like 41% for the spring Chinook and 50% for the fall Chinook. The variability in SARS can be explained by variability in those ocean factors. And that's all I had.
Great. Thank you so much. Everybody's been great about staying on time. I know that people are having some problems seeing the slides because it's not full screen. Penny, can you try using that magnifying glass at the bottom? We're going to continue to try to work on get this a little bit bigger. And while we're doing that, Jim, you don't have slides. I would welcome you to speak to question number 13.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? That was an advertisement, sorry. I submitted 3 different PowerPoint presentations that are in the box for people who are interested in them, and I just put them there for reference. I wasn't quite sure how this format was going to work, so I did not extract from those presentations the specific slides that might help, but I will just orally go through some comments on this. First of all, I think the variability that Richie showed in SAR values is really obvious, and it continues throughout all of the research that I've seen over my career. And there's one primary driver for that. Salmon are an amazingly complicated animal. For example, they have a 3 to 5 year life cycle. As you saw, they start in gravel hundreds of miles from the ocean. They migrate out to the ocean. They'll then spend 2 to 4 years in the ocean. So most of their life history experience is out in the ocean. And when they're in the ocean, we don't have a lot of information about what really happens to them. We have some about where they go, but even that is pretty vague, and it changes year by year. And then, as you can imagine, Richie's explanation of what's going on with ocean productivity is happening every year. So I was looking back at the studies that Richie gave you just a summary of. NOAA measures something like 23 parameters in the ocean. And if you look back over the last 4 years, the ocean has been generally what I would call a poor ocean, poor survival ocean. And so what that has is a huge effect on juvenile salmon as they try to grow and become adults and make their way back to their natal rivers. So it is a huge factor, and it changes year by year, largely by parameters outside of human control. The results of that are, I've seen several studies. One was done by NOAA years ago that tried to correlate SARS, smolt to adult return rates, with river conditions. So what's actually going on in the river? And those correlations were very poor. There was really no causality. And you can eyeball some of that from what you saw from Richie and Ed too, in that you see that SARS over the period from 2008 until now changed dramatically year to year, yet spill conditions over that period were constant. So clearly spill wasn't changing, river conditions were, ocean conditions were changing, and lots of other parameters that affect these animals over their life cycle were changing. So SARS moved dramatically from very low levels, less than 1%, to decent levels, over 3%, for largely reasons we don't have control of and we don't fully understand yet. An example of this is NOAA has a model. I'm surprised Richie didn't bring this out, but one of the things I provided in the materials I submitted was, Richie, an Excel spreadsheet that you presented to the REOG last fall, and it shows results of your model runs, not you personally, but NOAA's model runs using a model called COMPASS, which is a simulation model that tries to track and account for fish as they move down through the hydro system, out to the ocean, and then return back through the hydro system and migrate upstream. And those modeling exercises were specifically looking at what would be the likely change in SARS if we changed from BIOPS spill, the spill that was required in the 2008 and 14 BIOPS, the spill that we have been using since 2008, and we shifted from that to a 120% TDG spill standard. And the results of those studies were rather dramatic. They showed almost no effect, less than 1/100% change in survival. So for me, that showed me that model at least does not think that the changes in spill we're talking about are going to be very dramatic or going to have an effect on adult survivals that will lead to substantial changes. Another thing that strikes me about this is that we as humans tend to look for very simplistic and simple solutions to, as I said, an incredibly complex animal. And when we try to do that, we generally see that we're not actually doing things that are helpful. In many cases, I think we're doing things that are far beyond what economists call the point of diminishing returns. We're continuing to try to extract biological benefits from the hydro system when it has no more to give, at least none that we can technically identify at this point. So one of the things I took to heart was a study done a long time ago, 2000. It was done by the independent scientific group. Council asked them to do it, reviewing the Council's Fish and Wildlife Program. And I want to just read a quick conclusion. We conclude that efforts to apply technology to sustain salmon production in the absence of ecological functions, i.e. engineered substitutes for ecological functions, have generally proven unsuccessful, largely because efforts have failed to understand and incorporate the ecological processes they wish to replace. Instead, they often create something totally artificial. Restoration of particular species implies restoration of their ecosystems and to the greatest extent possible. I think we're still having trouble interpreting how to implement that in a way that actually can help fish, but one of the transitions that the 2008 buyout set underway was to start investing far more of Bonneville's resources in habitat and ecosystem function improvements than in continuing to search for hydrosystem improvements. So I'll stop there, and I probably saved you a couple minutes. I didn't hear the ding ding.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jim. So people have been asking me when they can ask questions, and I just want to reiterate that we have 2 more questions that we're going to run through the panel, and then we'll open it up. If you could hold off from writing them to me, that would be great. I'll ask for them, and then you can type them in. So moving on to the next question, considering what we know about southern resident orca Chinook prey needs, what are the overall potential benefits to the killer whales from spill? And for this, we're going to start with Guy Norman.
Well, thank you, Abby. And I do not have slides prepared for this either. So what I'm going to do is just offer some perspective that I have relative to the potential for spill to improve the prey for southern residents. I think we heard from previous speakers that one of those considerations is certainly the relative difference between survival in the base level spill current operations and an increased level of spill. So that's certainly one factor. But I think there's other factors as well. So for example, of the top 15 Chinook stocks listed in a NOAA study as priority prey for southern residents, about half are Columbia River stocks. So Columbia River stocks are important, but the question is what additional spill benefits due to that level of importance. So digging into that a little further, not all the stocks benefit equally with spill from the lower Snake and lower Columbia federal dams. There's a difference in dam passage experience of those individual Columbia River stocks depending on where they start their migration geographically. So some of the stocks, such as Lower River Fall and Lower River Spring Chinook, don't encounter the federal dams where the increased spill is being considered, so there's no additional benefit. However, the spring and summer Chinook from the Snake River encounter all 8 of the federal dams, while the upper Columbia Chinook encounter 4 of the dams, and the mid-Columbia Chinook encounter anywhere from 1 to 4 of the dams, depending where they originate. So the benefits of increased spill at the federal dams varies depending on the stock and where they come from. So how do you put those differences into perspective relative to influence of lower river snake and lower Columbia dam passage survival to available prey for southern residents? So the increased spill associated with increased gas levels applies to the spring period when flows are higher compared to the summer. So focusing on spring Chinook, which would be the most affected by any change associated with the gas levels, recent year averages show that about 1/3 of total adult Chinook returns to the Columbia are spring Chinook. The rest are summer and fall Chinook that pass the dam in the summer as juveniles. So of those spring Chinook that pass in the springtime, about 2/3 experience one or more of the Snake and Lower Columbia federal dams as juveniles. Of those, about half experience all 8 dams. So these are relative abundance and relative dam experience factors to consider when assessing overall benefit to southern residents associated with increased spill. Now, there's recognition that proportional abundance of priority stocks is not the entire picture. For example, we've heard there may be additional benefits from Columbia River spring Chinook due to their availability near the Columbia River mouth in late winter and early spring. However, the lower river spring Chinook stocks have more total spatial and time overlap with southern residents than the Snake or Upper Columbia stocks. So there's more encounter opportunity for lower Columbia and Willamette spring Chinook compared to the Snake River spring Chinook. Last factor is Columbia River hatchery fish. I just want to note that they're key to southern resident benefits. When you look at over 70% of the priority Chinook stock abundance is hatchery fish, and for spring Chinook, it's over 80% of the returns are hatchery fish in the Columbia River. So hatchery fish are going to continue to be a major factor into the foreseeable future, and any survival benefits from spill would apply to those hatchery migrants that are encountering the federal dams. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Guy. Next up and thank you, you did not go over very much. Next up for a quick 3-minute response is Michael Garrity.
Yeah, and I'll probably save some time. I agree with, I would just pretty much echo Guy's remarks. I might add that I can't remember if it was a slide from Steve or Ed that showed sort of the relative benefit the CSS predicts from increased spill from fish from rivers that encounter, fish that encounter 8 dams from the Snake or 3 from the John Day, showed the different percentage improvements. So I think you can get an idea there for those different stocks. But yeah, I'll just, I think we can move on to the next person.
Great, thank you. Jim Litchfield, you're up next.
Okay. I'm with Guy in that I didn't see a very clear connection between changes in spill that might affect Snake River Spring Chinook survival and how that would directly lead to a significant increase in prey availability for southern resident orcas. So what I think we need to look carefully at is what's really happening to the fish as they come down the Columbia River and they encounter each of these dams. Right now, most of the fish, even under the biop spill that we had in place up until this year, most of those fish are passing through spill. So what we're talking about is increasing the proportion of fish that go over the spillway. And by the way, even that term, and I saw that in a lot of the questions, over the spillway is not accurate. Spillways open at about 50 feet of depth. So fish that go through the spillway actually go from inside the water column at about 50 foot of depth to atmospheric pressure in an instant. So it's quite an experience. And in some places, spill is not the highest survival pathway through some of the dams. So none of these dams perform exactly the same. And we like to think that we can just wave a wand and make them all perform the same, but that's not how things actually operate out there. There are a lot of some issues with increased spill that we're still trying to struggle with, like how to manage to it. We had a lot of difficulty with that last spring, and so it is a difficult thing for me to see how a simple change, like let's just increase spill, will suddenly result in an obvious and large increase in prey availability for Orca Chinook from Orca Chinook.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Are you done?
Nope. Now I'm done. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Jim, I couldn't tell if you were taking a breath or if you had paused. Great. Thank you. And
I was doing both.
You have a little bit more time if you have anything else to add.
No, I'm fine. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Richie, let me take you off mute here and get you to your slides. Okay, go on ahead.
Okay, so I chose to try to focus this on, basically going back to freshman biology and hypothesis testing. How are we supposed to be doing science? And the null hypothesis that for the comparative survival study is that increasing spill levels would not have any significant effect on Chinook adult to adult returns. And of course, their hypothesis is that increasing spill levels will increase Chinook adult to adult returns. And, there's nothing wrong with that hypothesis per se. I don't have an axe to grind one way or the other, particularly on this issue. I would just say that when you're building models, ultimately when you are forced to try to assess what's going to happen beyond the range of the data you have in hand. So basically, all of the spill to date in the Columbia Basin has been limited at about 40% or maybe 45% average if you look at all the projects up and down the river. So the question becomes, okay, what's going to happen incrementally when you start spilling beyond those levels? And the true answer, I think, is we don't really know. I mean, there's a hypothesis that's being proposed. But what we can do is we can think about the logic of, what happens if the hypothesis turns out to be true or if the hypothesis turns out to be false. That's kind of what I tried to do here. And this echoes a little bit about what Guy was talking about with different potential effects for different groups of fish based on their travel experience through the hydrospace. So obviously, if the hypothesis is false, then you wouldn't expect there to be any significant effect for any of the species. It's just not going to change. You'll spill more water. The direct survival will stay about the same. You're not going to affect any latent mortality parameters, and you're going to get about the same range of SARS that we've been seeing. That's one option if it's false. If it's true, then you would expect that SARS would increase, as Guy noted, from the species that are experiencing the most spill opportunities at dams to the species at the bottom of my list that are experiencing none of that, which would be, pretty much all of the lower Columbia and Willamette Chinook. And the lower Columbia fish, as a reminder, those were actually put up as a higher valued species for orcas because they spend much more time in the waters off of the Washington coast. So, you can walk through that and say, okay, well, here's the stocks that would improve. And if I can have the next slide. Next slide, please. So what I tried to do here was to put down in the shaded areas where that paper said Chinook are needed to feed orcas. And I've overlapped that with the distribution of pit tag data from the last 5 or 6 years at Bonneville Dam. So if you back that up, fish are going to spend 2 to 4 weeks roughly in the estuary, and then they're going to stage off the Columbia River mouth for, weeks to, potentially, a month or two. We're not sure exactly, but they sit out there and they're waiting for the river temperatures to decrease so that they can come on in. But the main point of this graphic is that if you're looking at spring summer Chinook, which is the top left panel, all of those fish have migrated from Alaska down the coast, and they've gone into fresh water in the Columbia River, and they are no longer available for orcas to consume after October 1st. And in fact, most of them are and they're not available from probably, August or July. Sometime during the following year, to the left-hand side of that panel, probably in January, they aren't really available for orcas to consume either. But then sometime in that February, March, or April, May period, they would be available. So that's really kind of, to me, where the rubber hits the road and where you'd expect this particular stock to be a potential food source for orcas. And if you drop down to the next panel, that's kind of representative of Snake River Fall Chinook and probably Upper Columbia River Fall Chinook. And, there's probably not going to be very many of those fish that are available to orcas because they've already passed Bonneville Dam in August, and they've entered fresh water where they're out of reach of orcas before then. And then the top right panel is Upper Columbia River Spring Chinook. So, I think that's, one place where NOAA probably didn't do as good as we probably could have with the priority Chinook stocks is because the window of that assessment was so wide that you don't really get into the, in which months are these different species actually available. And again, that just echoes what Jim and Guy were saying about, needing to overlap in time and space, when these different prey items are available. And I've overrun my time, so pardon me.
That's okay. Thank you, Richie. Ed, you're next.
Thanks. So just following up on what we've heard prior, I think Guy Norman made it clear and that the importance of interior spring Chinook to southern resident killer whales is a strong hypothesis and well justified. Also bear in mind that these are some of the highest fat content Chinook because of the long journey ahead of them. And they reside off the mouth of Columbia during late winter, early spring, which has been identified as a period of nutritional deficit. And so for that group of fish, they fit very well. Spill is the quickest and most effective interim action that could be taken. You can implement it now to increase survival of both hatchery and wild fish that are already being produced. They're already in the queue. You can increase spill to benefit them in a very short order. You can potentially increase available forage by over 70% from this particular group of fish within only a couple of years of turning those dials to increase spill. And you will also benefit the fish that are being addressed from other actions, such as habitat work and additional hatchery production, because all of these interior spring Chinook go down through this same gauntlet of dams. Next. There are many ways to now equate the work from CSS and others on the benefits in survival associated with spill to potential meals for orcas. One of them is just a simple relationship, and I think Steve, Dr. Haseker after me is going to get into more detail on this, but this simply shows the relationship between Snake River SARs and the spring Chinook returns to the mouth of the Columbia River. It's actually a very tight relationship, and you can use this to get at potential increases in availability of prey for orcas. Next slide, please. So from this, if you take a look at the various spill levels and the associated SARs with that, you can get some indication of reasonable expectations for increases in the mean returns. And so, for example, the 115, 120 is the current BIOP levels. This is relative to the BIOP level. So the 115, 120 is the injunction levels, the 120%, and then the 125%. Definite substantive increases in the number of adults available. And if you look at the percent change, you can get up to over a 70% change in that particular group of fish's availability to orcas in a reasonably defensible or rational approach of calculating this. There are other ways of looking at this, but they all show this very substantive improvement. Thank you. Oh, I would mention on the spill benefits, I wanted to just say that in order for the actions needed for optimizing those benefits would be the removal of TDG constraints in the forebays of mainstem dams. I think we heard that earlier. And then an allowance in both Washington and Oregon for the TDG up to 125 during these migration periods.
Okay, thank you very much. Michelle and or Steve?
Okay, thank you. Just a quick comment on those previous model results that I was showing for John Day, Yakima River, Snake River SARs. I showed all that variability. Those models were able to account for 90% of the variability in SARs by including both freshwater factors and marine factors. The good work of the Science Center, Richie presented some of those results that were looking at only marine factors and is explaining 41%. So there's papers by myself in 2012, as well as papers by Howard Schaller and Dr. Petrosky that show the importance of both freshwater factors and marine factors. So just one point I wanted to clarify, and I can provide that information if folks are interested. As Ed had mentioned, there is a very good relationship between overall spring Chinook returns, both hatchery and wild. These are upriver stocks that originate above Bonneville, and the Snake River Wild SAR. So the Snake River Wild SAR serves as a very good predictor, a very good index of crosswalking expected SAR benefits to expected upriver spring Chinook returns to the Columbia River mouth. Next slide. So this is those previous SAR that I provided, looking at the different spill scenarios in comparison to the observed SARs from 2000 through 2012. Applying that relationship that I just showed between Columbia River mouth returns and these SARs, we can look at the expected changes in adult returns to the Columbia River mouth associated with these different spill options. Next slide. And that's what's presented here. In the red, historically, we've averaged about 200,000 spring Chinook returning to the Columbia River mouth and ranging between 95,000 and 345,000. If we continue with the BIOP, we're not expecting much change in those levels. However, if we move to increasing spill levels, we're looking at pretty substantive increases with a mean of 353,000 spring Chinook returning to the Columbia River mouth, ranging from 156,000 up to 646,000. Next slide. And so increasing spill is expected to improve spring Chinook returns to the Columbia River. And the way I've summarized it here is looking at the improvements in absolute numbers of spring Chinook returning to the Columbia River mouth. These are upriver stocks. We're not talking about the Willamette. We're not talking about below Bonneville stocks. These are interior Columbia River stocks originating above Bonneville Dam. With an increase, expected mean increase of 146,000 additional spring Chinook on average associated with the 125% spill level, and that can range from additional 35,000 all the way up to an additional 301,000. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's see. So we're going to move on to the final question that's set, and then we'll get into task force member questions. So what are the trade-offs of spill, i.e. lost revenue that could otherwise be used to pay for habitat restoration or economic and community impacts and others? So for this question, we are going to start with Jim. And Jim, give me 1 second to get you off of mute. Okay, go ahead.
You're putting me back on mute.
Oh, no, we can hear you.
Okay, well, I was off and then you put me back on. All right. So I think most folks are aware now that we have fundamental changes going on in the power system throughout the West. A lot of it has been driven by the mandates to develop large amounts of new renewable resources, such as wind and solar resources. That's fundamentally changed power markets. And one of the unintended consequences of that is it has led to large periods of time during the year when power prices are very low. Now, most folks would say, gee, that's wonderful. It's nice to see power prices low. That's good for everybody, right? Well, it's not good for everybody when you're a seller of power, and that tends to be the condition that Bonneville is in much of the year. So what's happened is Bonneville's revenues, as a result of fundamental shifts in the power system, have been declining due to the reduced prices at which they can sell power. That's had a direct impact on Bonneville because they have contracts with their customers that expire in 2028. And that's not all that far from now. 10 years in the power business is kind of a minimum lead time to be making arrangements for power supply. And what so happens is that Bonneville's rates right now are generally above power prices generally available in the marketplace. So Bonneville has undertaken a very aggressive effort to try to control its cost and to reduce its prices in order to try to continue to attract customers as they move towards that 2028 cliff, when all of their customers are going to be able to make other choices other than buying from Bonneville. So that's background so that you know the environment that Bonneville Power is in right now. So as spill increases, what does it do? It reduces the amount of power generation, and by reducing the amount of power generation, it reduces the amount of power that Bonneville can sell, and therefore it reduces Bonneville's revenues. Now, Bonneville estimated for the current injunction spill to the gas cap, 120% in the tail race, 115 in the forebay, that would cost them, on average, their initial estimate was something like $40 million. Recently, they gave a presentation to the council, and they said that they had refined that estimate. They thought it was now $38.6 million. But what is that number? That's an average cost over what is called an 80-year record of water conditions that Bonneville might experience. Now, I haven't seen the range, but that can range from something very close to zero. In other words, there wasn't a lot of cost because flows were so high that we were in conditions of inadvertent spill, and we saw a lot of those conditions last May. Or it could be extremely high if we're in conditions like 2000, 2001, where we're having a critical water year and power prices are extremely high. So it's not the average doesn't give you a very useful statistics. There's significant upside risk for Bonneville and little downside. In other words, they can go to zero cost, but their expected cost is somewhere around $38 million. Now, Bonneville, in order to try to maintain its economic viability, has begun to look for ways of trying to manage its overall fish and wildlife costs, which have been in excess of $250 million direct costs and another $200 to $300 million, depending on markets, for what are called lost revenues, and the revenues from spill, but also impacts from flow requirements that Bonneville is required to implement under the biological opinion to try to assist fish moving out of the system. The overall effect of this on Bonneville has been to actually cost them in excess of $500 million a year and upwards of over $1 billion, depending on market conditions. So as Bonneville sees increases being mandated by courts or others to increase spill, what they have begun to do is realize that they need to cut back on other costs, and they have started to reduce fish and wildlife investments as a result. And so appropriately, I think they're trying to target those fish and wildlife investments that are the least productive, But that's difficult to do in that everyone thinks their particular fish and wildlife program is the most productive and is starting to ripple through to effects on investments in what has been a new direction for Bonneville and the region, and that is towards ecosystem function, improving habitat, and also improving hatcheries and hatchery practices. I'm done.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Ed, you're up next.
All right, thank you. So as Jim mentioned, obviously during periods when river flows are manageable, not the uncontrolled spill type periods, but during those periods, spilling water can reduce the water available for power production, and this can come at a cost, no doubt about it. There are also many times, as Jim mentioned, when that spilled water does not come at a cost and is above and beyond what can be used for generation. But given the changing power dynamics and markets associated with integration of renewals that Jim was alluding to, I think this whole question is a bit of standing where we're at, looking backwards. And I think there's really a healthy discussion of how potentially to move forward in this changing energy dynamic, incorporating spill and renewables and Bonneville solvency moving forward. And so state, tribal, and federal co-managers, along with the action agencies operating the dams and marketing power, are exploring a much more flexible approach to spill and power production. The idea here is to benefit fish power and allow for the integration of these renewables in that process. So the concept is prioritizing spill for fish conservation when hydropower profitability is lower, and reducing spill and prioritizing power production when hydropower is most profitable, looking for somewhat of a sweet spot that allows for that profitability to flourish at certain times. Next slide. So I'm gonna tee up what's called the duck curve. I encourage everybody to Google and explore this a little bit. As a fish scientist, this has been fascinating for me. But this shows the kind of changing dynamics of load as well as profitability opportunities, and the sort of sway in the back of the duck as each year progresses is the integration of renewables within the California market. And that is dampening the need for other power and the profitability of Bonneville or others in selling into that market. But there are periods in the evening, as you can see, where the ramping needs up as because we currently cannot store solar or wind energy in an economical way. So those ramp periods are incredibly profitable for power production. And so the concept here is to spill during those periods of night and middle of the day when profitability is much lower and demand can be met with alternatives, and then provide some flexibility for power production during that early morning and then the evening hours in a flexible way to take advantage of the markets. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this just shows quickly the challenge that's here. If you look at the top, it shows the kind of average price above zero. You actually go in during the daylight hours. That's a 24-hour day where it's actual negative pricing relative to these particular markets. You also see that on the bottom slide with the increases from 2012 to 2017 in those shoulders, the morning hours and the evening hours, with a huge dramatic decline during the day with negative pricing occurring then. Next slide. So if we're trying to balance the benefits of spill with these new changing power dynamics, one of the ways to look at this is implementing this sort of duck curve approach to flexibility using a 125% total dissolved gas spill. And you'll see this is, spill volume does go down because of this flexibility of allowing power markets to make hay when that is profitable. But you can see that this is models out on the fish side to be less than the 125% 24/7, but still a robust package. And folks are looking into this option to see if there may be a way to incorporate this approach and learn from it as early as the next year. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one, go to the next. So for this flexible spill and power, for it to work, we've got to be able to optimize the benefits of spill during those hours when hydropower is least profitable. And if we don't do that, then you're going to have to spill more for more hours. And so to optimize the benefits of spill when it is occurring, we must have the allowance for 125% during these priority spill hours.
Great. Thank you so much, Ed. Michael Garrity from WDFW.
Yeah, so I think both Jim and Ed spoke well to the changes that are happening in the energy market that create, I think, both an opportunity and really, it's from my fish and wildlife perspective, kind of a need for Bonneville to explore ways to adjust to current markets. And I agree with Ed that this flexible duck curve spill operation is promising, and part of the reason that it might make sense for fish and wildlife agencies to make the compromise sort of in a little bit lower than 24 hours, 7 days a week spill to the highest sort of safe levels is that we care about Bonneville's bottom line as as sort of a part of the Washington state government and its importance in the regional economy. And then B, we want Bonneville to continue to have a robust fish and wildlife program that includes good hydro measures, but also strong habitat, tributary and estuary habitat programs and hatchery programs and that kind of thing. And if we can find that sweet spot that Ed was talking about, we might be able to sort of have a win-win there. So I'll stop there so we can hopefully get the questions before 5 o'clock.
Great, thank you. And I think we're going to go 10 minutes over for anyone who can stay on the line. Guy, do you have a response to the cost?
So I think Jim,
and I'll
Ed,
briefly. Thank you.
Yes, Jim, Ed, and Michael covered a whole lot. I think I would just state that the Bonneville Fish and Wildlife Program has grown over the years. It'll be close to double to the current level, about $250 million since post-ESA. And that program includes mitigation for wildlife, resident fish, and anadromous fish, but about 2/3 of it's for salmon and steelhead, or about $175,000 a year. So that connect between the direct program that funds a number of conservation efforts for fish and the spill program for the hydro system, they are interconnected both in terms of cost and in terms of Bonneville's financial health. And so I would just reiterate, I think there's general recognition by the co-managers that Bonneville's future financial health is essential to maintain the level of fish and wildlife mitigation that's necessary in the basin to meet fish recovery and other mitigation objectives, including spill, and that this idea of a flexible spill operation that has the opportunity to increase fish survival as well as reduce costs for ratepayers, I think is a reasonable objective, and I think that there is a lot of interest in achieving that.
Great. Thank you very much. So it's 4:52. I'm sure that this has been a lot of information for everyone. I just put out a note in the chat box that says for task force members only, if you have questions, please submit them and I'll read them in the order that they come into, figure out which panelist would like to respond. I have just about everybody on mute, so if you're trying to speak, please be in touch via chat. Okay, we have our first question. Are the panelists ready? This is from George Harris. And the question is, I've talked with Orca scientists on the task force and the prey work group, and they've told me that they think a critical forage time for orca, especially pregnant orcas, during winter and early spring. This is a time when the large fatty spring Chinook should be concentrating at the mouth of the Columbia before they head upriver. The orca frequent this area in winter and spring, and the NOAA data shows that often spring Chinook are in short supply compared to historic numbers. The questions are, how will increasing spill to 125% impact spring Chinook returns? Is there anything better than spill to meet the short-term needs of orca for this critical time? And will increased spill help hatchery and wild Chinook populations? So let's see. I'm going to take all panelists off mute, and whoever would like to start, just pipe up now.
Steve Hazeker. I think I provided that information, and so hopefully the person posing the question can look at that. The returns that I was projecting include both hatchery and wild spring Chinook destined for areas upriver of Bonneville Dam, and those slides present those forecasts of exactly how many upriver hatchery and wild spring Chinook we would expect associated with each spill option.
Great, thank you. I believe, Ed, you have your hand up as well to answer that.
Yes. I think I touched on answers to that in my PowerPoint as well. I'm not aware of any other actions that we can take for this particular group of spring summer Chinook that could get you as quick a response and as substantive a response as providing that spill levels and flexibility. So I think that is your best. It does help both hatchery and wild. It does help benefit those fish improve through habitat actions and hatchery actions, which will be lagged much longer. We could see benefits within 2 years relative to orca meals based on when we're shifting the spill amounts, and that's very quick.
Great, thank you. Jim, you have your hand up to answer.
Yeah. Am I off mute?
Yep.
Okay, so you attached, and I'm sure you've all seen on the task force, the Southern Resident Killer Whale Priority Chinook Stocks Report from NOAA and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I noted in that the ranking that was produced at the end in the matrix that Upper Columbia Snake River Falls Chinook were rated high. The spill we're talking about is not going to help Snake River Falls Chinook. They come out in the summer. So most of our conversation today does not really benefit that stock. The second, right below them is Fraser, of course. Then Lower Columbia and Middle Columbia, both of those stocks are real important and would see little benefit from the spill we're talking about. Some, but not much. Snake River Spring, Summer Chinook are important, but not as important as the other fish. That's the stock that we're mostly talking about today. And I think as Richie tried to piece apart here, that stock is not a tremendously productive stock to aid in providing orca prey.
Great, thank
so
you. And Richie,
just take a
have your
look.
hand up too.
Yeah.
I just was going to point out that, I kind of tried to get at that with the one slide that I presented, trying to think logically about when these fish would be available from what stock and time and space. And, again, this is a hypothesis. I think, as Ed noted, there's discussions going on about, whether it works to do this or not. We'll have to see how this play out. The only other response I would have to the question is that the federal action agencies, that is Bonneville Power Administration, the Corps of Engineers, and the Bureau of Reclamation, as everybody knows, is going through a NEPA process to look at and evaluate a bunch of these things. I believe that the 125% spill scenario is one of the things that they're evaluating through their NEPA process, as well as dam breaching. So that would be the other opportunity for change. Pointing out there's a process underway.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question because I'd like to get to as many task force members as possible. And I've left all panelists off mute, so just know that. The next question is from Jacques White, task force member, Long Live the Kings. How certain is the DUC 125 estimate for SAR versus the straight 125 modeled estimate? Ed, I think I'm going to call on you. I don't know if your hand's up yet.
It wasn't, but I will jump in, and then we'll have Dr. Haysicker follow up, who's run some of that analysis. So so that particular is based on powerhouse avoidance, and so the certainty associated with that is related to just the ability of the spill volumes to help fish avoid encountering the powerhouse and the associated forebay delay and stresses associated with that could affect their subsequent survival. And so I would say that it is certain from the standpoint of the powerhouse avoidance and how that relates to these prospective models relative to the SARs associated with avoiding powerhouse. And it's based on the spill volumes associated with 125% during those hours when you'd be prioritizing spill, and then looking at a lower spill rate, biop type rate of spill during the hours where you're focusing on more power production.
Great, thank you very much. Let's go Steve and then Jim.
Yeah, I would just say that these models, the forecasts under the DUC 125 spill versus the 125 versus any of those other ones have a similar level of certainty and uncertainty. The only difference between those runs is essentially a slight change into the number of powerhouses that we would expect fish to encounter. And so that's why there's a slightly lower SAR associated with that DUC 125 spill scenario than the 125.
Great, thank you. And then Jim.
Yeah, so I had to quickly go look this up. The idea of spilling to 125 is not brand new. It was proposed to the council back in 2013. There's an ISAB, Independent Science Advisory Board, report and review of that proposal, which points out a number of uncertainties with the analysis. So I'd recommend it to the task force. The number is ISAB 2014-2. It's available on the council's website.
Thank you. Okay,
and then just to be clear, just to be clear though, I think the question was related to the duck spill, and the report Jim is referring to does not contemplate the certainty around the duck spill operations. Just want to be clear on that.
Yeah, I agree, but it does deal with what Steve was saying, which was the predicted power of the regression analysis that underlies both of those scenarios.
And this is Steve again.
Go ahead.
I just to add that 2013 ISAB review was based off some of the earlier work, looking at different spill management options. Since that time, the CSS has responded to all of the issues that the ISAB raised in their review of that in 2013, and that response to the ISAB was produced in 2017, and that is also available on the council website.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next question from Task Force member Jamie Stevens, which I've posted so everyone can see. What is the net impact to revenue if the flexible spill model described is implemented on these 4 dams? Okay, Steve, is that your hand up?
No.
Jim?
This is Michael. I can speak a little bit to that. First, it would be implemented at the 4 Lower Snake and 4 Lower Columbia dams. It would be 8 dams, and I think the idea of the flexible or duck curve spill operations would be to have in 2019 as a potential pilot year for that, it would be to sort of equal or exceed the survival benefits for fish and equal or exceed the sort of power foregone, basically equal or save Bonneville some money relative to the 2018 spill to the gas caps operation. And that, as I understand it, that analysis is still underway. I haven't heard all of it yet from Bonneville. Our Guy Norman's colleague on the Power Council for Washington, Tom Carrier, has done some research into this and seemed to think it was plausible as a way to at least break even with last year's operations and maybe get ahead. But there's still some work to be done on it from what I know. I don't know if Ed or Guy has more to add on that.
So I think Michael summed it up. This is Guy. Summed it up pretty well. I think the bottom line target is relative to last year's or this year's 2018 spill to the gas cap, which Bonneville estimates on average would cost about $40 million a year. The idea is to, through the duck spill scenario, is to increase fish survival relative to that base at a decreased cost to Bonneville in terms of foregone revenue that would be part of that spill. So that's the overall objective, and I think the co-managers, technical folks, are working on those scenarios to look at the feasibility of that.
Thank you, Guy. See if there are any other comments from panelists. Otherwise, I'll post the next question from Mindy Roberts.
This is Richie. I just have a point of clarification with Guy. The duck spill that you're discussing, that's to the 120% and not the 125%. Is that correct?
I was really speaking in general to an overall objective. Okay. So as Michael indicated, 2019 could be a pilot year. That could be potentially a break even for fish survival and revenue, and then could be followed up with subsequent years trying to meet the objective of increasing fish survival relative to that while decreasing cost.
Okay, thank you. I just know that both of those things have been discussed in our conversation today and wanted to be as clear as possible for the task.
Thank you for the clarification.
This is just Ed again to reiterate that the fish modeling shows long term that the 125 is the best way to ensure that it's a win on the side of the fish side, and then on the power side, using the 125 allows you to optimize this effectiveness of spill during those hours when power is least profitable. And so the concept there is to not have to continue spilling at higher levels into those more profitable hours. So that's why the 125 is important.
I'm going to move us on to what's probably the last question. I do see that some other task force members have questions, and I would encourage them to reach out to the panel members whose information is in the box account. But the final question for today is from Mindy Roberts, and the question is, if dams increase spill, is there any permanent damage to the system, or is the only concern that it won't achieve the SAR that CSS suggests?
You go for it, Richie.
This is Richie Graves. My understanding is that there are some structural concerns at particular locations. Bonneville Dam, for example, there is an erosional issue. There's just so much energy from that amount of water coming through the spillway that they have had some erosion concerns there, or some erosion issues in past years, where the back roll from that energy was basically digging materials out from under the apron, which is the concrete pad at the bottom of the spillway that the water drops down onto. So there are some concerns I know that the action agencies have with respect to just the sheer force of that water day in and day out for long periods of time. But it's not at every project, it's some projects.
Yeah, I agree with that, Richie, is Jim. But the other part of your question, I think, needs a little more development, because the worst case is not that we just don't achieve the SAR improvements. The worst case is that these high TDG levels, remember the underlying standard is 110. And Washington and Oregon in the early 90s went through an extensive rulemaking to develop the waivers that we've been operating under, which are the 120, 115, 120 tail race, 115 forebay in Washington. And the primary concern through those hearings was the ecological effects of high TDG levels, not just on fish, but the entire aquatic environment. So operating routinely to 125, yes, we have spill levels that go above that from time to time, but operating that way for 2.5 months is something that we really have never done in this system. So hard to predict what it will do to the river system.
Yeah, this is Michael. I agree with Richie on the structural issue that it has to be tailored at each dam, but most of them there aren't concerns, and at the ones where there are, those concerns have been identified through modeling, and everybody agrees they'd be avoided. So I don't think it's a real concern as long as that remains the case. I'd say, there's always risk with models that they might not deliver what you expect, but the evidence seems compelling enough that that if we can find a good way to do it, that it's worth moving there. And unlike some actions that we may talk about on future webinars, spill is adjustable and implementable right away. And then on to the total dissolved gas point, Jim raises a fair point, and WDF, if gas caps are raised, WDFW would work with the Department of Ecology to have a good monitoring plan in place to make sure there aren't unintended consequences to any aquatic life as a result of increased spill levels. Based on past experience with high flow years, we haven't seen anything, but that monitoring still needs to be in place.
I think I need to cut us off there, unfortunately. I want to recognize that we had 3 outstanding task force member questions from Brian Gadd, and another one from George Harris, and one from Michael Messina that I do want to include in any follow-up information that goes out. So Penny, I'm going to turn it over to you for next steps. Is that okay?
Sure. I just want to remind everyone there are a couple more webinars that are coming up, so you should have calendar invitations for those, and the invitations to the public should be going out shortly if they haven't already. And so join us for one about the Lower Snake River dams and another about salmon and changing ocean conditions and ocean acidification. So those will be coming up in the next few weeks. As for the recommendations, the potential recommendations around spill, the task force has been reviewing some potential recommendations that came from the working groups, including one around spill. Then the next step is for that list of recommendations to go out in the draft report, which will be live for everyone in the public on the 24th, which is Monday. And there'll be time for public comment then. And then all of that public comment will then be rolled up and delivered to the task force so that you can use that information in your deliberations starting at the next meeting on October 17 and 18. So that's kind of the process we have ahead of us in the near future. And I just wanted to very much thank the panelists so much for their work to prepare and to be on the webinar. And thanks everyone for joining.
Great. I think